Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Two Americas, two intensely charged and opposing news narratives. Do cable news networks reflect these divisions, or rather function as triggers intensifying cultural divide? Also, what has happened to journalism? Is it now a profession inhabited by hacks and the politically possessed? Cross-Talking America Divided. I'm joined by my guest, Rob Taub in New York. He's a political pundit and journalist contributing to the Huffington Post. Also in New York, we have Julio Rivera. He is the editorial director of Reactionary Times and a Newsmax columnist. And in Los Angeles, we have Ron Placone. He is a comedian, a frequent guest on The Jimmy Dore Show and The Young Turks, as well as host of his own streaming show, Get Your News On with Ron. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. Ron, you got up earliest for this program, so you were elected to answer the first question here. You know, a great deal of my time, I watch cable news. I try to watch as much of all of them to get a variety of them. And, you know, it's obvious to say that we live in two very, very different Americas. The two Americas that don't know each other at all anymore. So when I look at the cable news networks, I mean, do they reflect this cultural divide, or are they really intensifying it? I mean, do they magnify it? Because you certainly would get that feeling looking at MSNBC and Fox. Go ahead.
I think that they definitely intensify a divide, yes. Do they reflect what's really going on in the States or amidst the people that live here? I would say absolutely not. And to the point where I try very hard to no longer even use the phrase mainstream media.
Yeah, okay.
I try to refer to it to what it is. I call it the corporate media, because that's what it is. It's owned by a small elite group of corporations. They have an agenda. They have a narrative. They have certain things that they're not allowed to talk about. But as far as the division goes, I mean, yeah, and you brought up the memo as a for instance, and I think that's a very good example. You know, on one side, you had at MSNBC trying to make it out like, oh, this is absolutely nothing. Then on the other side, you know, on Fox News, for instance, you had, oh, this is absolutely everything. And the truth is that, you know, there are things to learn in every given rhetorical event. So, yeah, there's certainly an agenda, but really it's just most of the time political theater between the most elite among us, and isn't really reflecting what's going on in the United States. And more people are disenfranchised with the media. That's
why people come to us and other alternative media. Jimmy Dore, you're on very often, and I really much enjoy his program.
That's why I have a job,
And he's a progressive. I consider myself a conservative, but I find him a reasonable person. I find you a reasonable person to talk to. And Rob, more or less the same question to you, because it seems to me if you look at MSNBC and then you look at Fox, basically what both are doing is they're reacting to a status quo that is changing. And I think that rattles both of them, okay? Because we're still reeling from the election of Donald Trump. And the media is trying to, or not trying to, adjust to that political reality. So it seems to me that, you know, before the media horizon, there was the terrain was there. People understood it. But it's changed very radically since then. And I think that sees the extremes, the networks that I've just mentioned. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, when Ron was talking about corporations, I mean, what are we doing? We're going for ratings because they're going to make more money. And I used to be a 3 times a week guest on Fox, representing, I would say, what I called myself as a sane liberal, as opposed to a knee-jerk liberal or a complete jerk liberal. Those are my different types of liberals. But I'm going to harken back to a book written in 1973 that's always been one of my favorites, and it's really proved prescient. News from Nowhere by Edward J. Epstein. And he was talking about how television news was terrible because they don't actually provide you real news. They're getting fed information from big corporations and from PR departments. And so what I find offensive is I actually got into a little not a shoving match, but a little verbal jousting years ago with Matt Lauer because he gave me this "I'm a journalist" kind of thing at a function. And he's a journalist like I'm Tom Brady. And we've forgotten what real journalism is, and we don't have shoe leather on the sidewalk journalism anymore, but we may not be able to have that because who's going to pay for it? So where do we, in effect, get real news from, except sources and leaks?
That's a good point. Julio, it seems to me that it has got down to just hacks because, as I said in the introduction of the program, is that, I'll be very open with, I'm very sympathetic to like Tucker Carlson, for example. I think he's a pretty reasonable person, and he has opposing people on all the time on his program. But if you look at like Hannity and you look at Rachel Maddow, I mean, they never let anything that disturbs their world enter it. And I find that really disturbing because that's just basically giving red meat to your viewers. You're not teaching them anything. You're just reaffirming. It's an affirmation process in watching the two that I just mentioned here. And I don't think that they use a whole lot of news. It's an enormous amount of spin. Go ahead, Julio.
Well, no, not necessarily.
Okay.
I mean, this is the one thing I would say. And to speak to, Rachel Maddow and her colleague over at MSNBC, Mika Brzezinski, saying, and she was quoted as saying, we have to control what people think. I mean, I think it needs to be fact-based. I think there is an extreme lack of integrity in reporting at this point.
I agree.
But the truth of the matter is that outlets like Fox and Newsmax are actually reporting facts, things that have gone on. And if you look at Donald Trump, when he was on his Asian tour, he struck an energy deal that closed our trade deficit with China by about $80 billion. If you looked at the news that day, the news was the speculation that this Russia probe supposedly was going to shift to Trump directly. And now we're looking at this in February, still hasn't yielded anything substantial that they can pin to Trump. So it's always been about trying to make the Trump administration look bad from the left. And there is a little bit of a defense mechanism going on in right-leaning media, but it's usually a lot more fact-based coming from the right. Yeah, well, I would agree. I mean, the memo, for example, I mean, when you look at CNN and MSNBC, they're just in denial, okay? I mean, 1 hour they say it's a danger to national security, and then when it's released, they say it's nothing here, move along, nothing to see. I mean, they're in denial here. Let me go to Ron in Los Angeles. I mean, in that sense, I would agree with Julio. I mean, they don't even want to address the content of the memo, for example. I read it. It's very interesting. It's something I think is very, very important. But you have the liberal corporatist media, I will take your term, they just dismiss it out of hand because, again, it endangers what they believe is the status quo, and they have the right and the privilege to tell the world how to think or tell the American public how to think. Go ahead, Ron.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm a very progressive guy, and I used to really love Rachel Maddow. I used to consider her a diamond in the rough, but recently, I say if you watch Rachel Maddow's show and you take a shot of vodka every time she says the word Russia,
you're gonna be
I think the average person would probably be dead within 20 minutes. The media has a very... The media has a very corporate agenda.
I'm going to try that tonight.
They very much...
Rob, don't do it.
I'm not responsible.
Don't do it. No, you did.
I don't.
And crosstalk will not be held responsible.
I got to protect myself here. I don't recommend anyone doing that.
Okay,
I don't recommend anyone actually doing that.
We'll put a disclaimer on at the end of the program. Okay, finish up, Ron. Go ahead.
Thank you. But yeah, I mean, they have their corporate, I'll give another, for instance, MSNBC is owned by Comcast. You've not seen an honest report on net neutrality from MSNBC. You haven't really seen it in any of the corporate media, but especially not from them because they're owned by Comcast, a very anti-net neutrality company. When DAPL was going on, all of the corporate media, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, they're all funded in large part by oil and gas companies. So, of course, they're not going to tell you what's going on in terms of a water protest. Where do you hear about that? You hear about that from the journalists that are on the ground.
Ron, on that
people
point,
like that.
On that point, I do remember watching across the board and almost one of those rare moments of unity. Everybody said, it's important, period. We didn't get anything more than that, okay? I learned more about net neutrality listening to the Jimmy Dore show. It was an excellent program on net neutrality. I learned an enormous amount there.
Thank you.
Okay, Rob, let me go back to you. One of the things that I find really disturbing in our political discourse is that if you oppose someone, they're a traitor. They act in a treasonous way. And I criticize Donald Trump for that, and I certainly criticize MSNBC and CNN for peddling the same thing. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, one of the things that really used to infuriate me when I was a regular contributor to Fox, I've always been a Democrat, is I had people that would suddenly contact me on Facebook or via Twitter or an email and say, I can't believe you're a traitor and you're on Fox. And then I would respond and say, well, did you see me when I was on this week? No, I won't watch it. Well, then how do you know what I'm saying or what I'm contributing? And really, as a result of Fox, I've met a lot of interesting conservative people that I never would have met who follow me on Twitter or I've spoken to on Sirius Radio, and I really enjoy the interaction between us. One of the things I think that we have to make the distinction about also is that there are news shows and there are opinion shows.
Sure.
The problem is that the opinion shows have taken over, and the news shows, many of them are letting too many opinions creep in, and it can be with a raised eyebrow or an inflection, and that's wrong if you're supposed to be a reporter and you're giving the news, and you're supposed to let the viewer or the reader
Rob,
decide.
let me jump in here before we go to the break. Before we go to the break. But I tend to think, particularly with this Russiagate thing, and it was the liberal corporate stations, facts get in the way of spin for them, and I think that's why you get so few facts. I mean, the memo, the contents of the memo wasn't really discussed, but it was about the timing of it. Well, no, we have the memo. We can read it. We can talk about it. No, okay, well, we'll have to wait for the Democratic one. I mean, this is what irritates me. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on the media and the divide in America. Stay with RT. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. To remind you, we're discussing the media and the divide in America. Julio, let me go to you in New York here. I asked Rob about using the word traitor and being considered treacherous or treasonous here. It's very difficult to have a conversation with someone after you've called them that, okay? And this is what I find very dangerous. I mean, I can give you a real-life example, from the great saga called Russia, 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 okay? And all of the name-calling of leaders around the world, and then how do you sit down and talk? Okay? And I think that this is what's really foolish about journalism. I mean, you get that hyperventilation, that, you get the adrenaline rush and you feel really great, but then when you think about what you just said, and you're supposed to be some kind of play some kind of public roles, adding value to the public sphere, and then you call he's a traitor, you're a traitor. It doesn't get down to, it's not disagreeing with someone now. It is, you're morally unacceptable. That's not what we should do in journalism. Go ahead, Julio.
Well, I think that the problem is the word moderate has become a dirty word. I think that the left has gone far to the left. I think the right has gone far to the right, even to the point where you have a ton of Republican infighting. I mean, we've got phrases like rhino, sellout Republicans, anytime, they want to make a deal with the Democrats. So that's kind of the world that we're operating in right now. But unfortunately, it's being fueled, I think, more or less because the larger percentage of mainstream media sources, although that's kind of a dirty word that we don't always like to use, are so skewed against the president. They've been trying to undermine President Trump this entire time, so that's why their reporting right now isn't really necessarily reporting. It's 100% spin. It's almost like their news programs have become opinion programs, and there isn't really a lot of, let's say, moderate or middle-of-the-road news that exists anymore in America.
Ron, I saw Trey Gowdy on Face the Nation. the country needs more people like that. You may disagree with his politics, but at least he listened to hard questions and he acknowledged some give and take, which was so refreshing to see. It was a really remarkable moment. But you know what again, if we compare, let's say, Hannity and Rachel Maddow, you know, both of them have one thing in common, one phrase. Our democracy is at stake. Our democracy is being threatened, but for very, very different ways. Again, maybe I'm off on this here, but it's the status quo, the new status quo that's coming into being that they don't seem to understand here. We have a FBI that has gone rogue. It's been gotten rogue for a long time. It's nothing new. It's just the curtain has revealed this. This has been going on a long time. Does anybody remember J. Edgar Hoover? I mean, I do. Okay, as a child at least. Okay, so I mean, you know, using this, you know, our democracy is under threat. I find that really hard to believe in, and I find it very disingenuous. Go ahead, Ron.
I'm 100% with you. And in fact, whenever somebody says to me, hey, Trump hijacked our democracy, you know, I don't like Trump, but my response is, well, we were kind of overdue to look into a new one anyway, so maybe that's a blessing in disguise. Yeah. And you hit the nail on the head with the status quo comment, Peter. What nobody really wants to talk about in the corporate media is that the status quo is broken. And Julio, I would say to you, you know, I think on a lot of issues we probably don't see eye to eye. But I think that the reason that moderate has become a quote-unquote dirty word isn't necessarily because being moderate is right or wrong, but because the status quo is so completely broken and people are disenfranchised as a response to that. You know, Donald Trump ran on this idea of some kind of outsider, some kind of, you know, guy that was really going to disrupt the status quo. You know, and whether folks bought that or not, you know, I personally didn't. I don't think that's what he is at all. But that's what he ran on, and that's what he sold. And people bought into that because they're so tired of the status quo and neoliberalism.
Okay, well, Rob,
he has done it on some levels, though.
Continue. Go ahead. Julio?
No, I'm saying he has done it on some levels.
Are you going to Ron or to Rob?
We've seen as far...
Keep going, Julio. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead to New York. Go ahead.
Oh, no, okay. I'm sorry. I apologize. It's the delay. I'm sorry. No, but he has done that on some levels, and I think that that's the reason that why there's been so much opposition to him, you know, because we're going to finally, I think, and they're going to do this to themselves. I think the elements that were anti-Trump are going to lead to, you know, uncovering a lot of the things that went on during the Obama administration, you know, things that were conducted by Hillary Clinton, things that were conducted by Barack Obama, the Justice Department, you know, Loretta Lynch, Eric Holder. All this information is going to come out as a result of their crybabying and being anti-Trump, because he was ultimately seen as a threat because he's not really necessarily in bed with a lot of these people that were the status quo for a long period of time.
You bring up a really interesting point, and let me go to Rob right now, because it's something that I've been mulling over quite a bit, and again, it's this memo issue here, is that, you know, it seems to me, and I read the memo very carefully, and I find it very believable, okay? Unfortunately, I have to follow this story 24/7. It's forced on you, and it's a fictitious story. But what isn't fictitious is malfeasance at the highest level of the DOJ and the FBI. I mean, I am convinced of that, and I thought the memo was laid out a very interesting narrative. But Rob, the problem is the mainstream media just denies it. And I find that, and this is what part of this cultural civil war that is brewing in the United States, is that you do have a part of the population, of the public, that is aware of these, what I think are reasonable facts to believe, and then you have the corporatists here in the media denying it. And I think that that can't be elevated in the air for very long, because people are going to say, well, I mean, Flynn is going to go to jail, Manafort's going to go to jail, but, you know, Comey lied, Clinton lied to the FBI, and they're not going to go to jail. And at that point, there's going to be a train wreck. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, first of all, I think we're getting into way too much supposition, which is a big problem right now in the media. Media shouldn't be acting on either side, be it right or left or whomever,
absolutely,
as a judge, jury, and executioner.
Absolutely.
I mean, and And comparative, okay. And just as an aside, I'm sorry, but I've been chuckling about this. When J. Edgar Hoover got mentioned, I thought, what kind of nickname would Trump come up with him? Cross-dressing J. Edgar? But anyway, I'm going to get a little tangential here, Peter.
Okay.
Peter, Ron, and Julio. But one of the things that really bugs me, and I feel that people who do what we do, at least at the highest echelons, and I'm talking about the highest paid people, like a Maddow or Sean Hannity, if I were king, I would force them to get on the 3rd Avenue bus with me, where it originates way down in the Bowery, and ride it all the way up to 125th Street a couple of times a week. Because I like to do that. I get stories there, I meet people there, and I interact with the actual public that I then speak to on radio, television, or via a column. And I think that if you're going to call yourself a journalist and you don't do that, and instead you ride around in a limousine and make your $30 million a year, or whatever it's going to be, I don't understand how you feel that you can aptly communicate with the public. So I think we have a big problem there.
I agree.
It's kind of like being a professional athlete now. I mean, are you really in touch with your fan base?
Yeah, I mean, Ron, being a journalist in television is just another word for being a high-paid celebrity, okay? I suppose, they're going to have their own, celebrity awards where everybody shows up, okay? But, Ron, this is one of the things that I find worrisome, is that you have a corporate media that has no interest in the public whatsoever. They have a bottom line. They have their donors. They have their sponsors and all that. I mean, for them, that system is perfected here. But they get further and further away, because I'm convinced that it was the corporatist media that elected Donald Trump by calling the rest of us deplorables, okay, and running with that and smearing at us and laughing at us and talking down to us, okay? And I think that I'm from the Midwest. People don't like to be talked that way from both coasts, okay? It's going to happen again in 2020 if they don't change their tune. Go ahead, Ron.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I mean, I do think that the corporatist media did elect Donald Trump. And this is, just the whole model. I say that if you want a democratic experiment to be successful and you have the media structure that we have in the United States, that would be a lot like wanting to open a gourmet restaurant and cooking exclusively with Spam and no other ingredient. I mean, it's just not the right kind of structure to have the society we want. The one silver lining in all that, though, is that, I mean, people are leaving cable television news in droves. I mean, the confidence in cable news gets lower and lower every year. There's academic studies that come out constantly. There was a Harvard study recently that revealed that what the media talks about and what people actually care about is so disproportional. It's about 75% to 6%. Yeah. And that's why people like me have a job. That's why, that's why there's shows on YouTube that are sustainable now. Yes, because people are so thirsty for actual news, and they're finding it.
I'll give you Mark Dice. I mean, his daily video. I mean, he's competing with the major networks. This one guy, okay? I mean, Jimmy Dore does very well. And anytime Jordan Peterson is on anyone's program, the hits go through the ceiling here. I'm agreeing with Ron. Let me go to Rob because I think people are so desperate to hear different voices and stop having spin pounded down your throat all the time. Go ahead, Rob.
Well, the last time I was on the show, what we discussed is one of my favorite lines from the classic film broadcast news is Albert Brooks says, we're in trouble when we become more important than the story. Yeah. And there is way too much spin. And we're also, it becomes so much about ratings. And I started in scripted television on comedy shows. And, I learned early, well, it doesn't matter if you're funny or if it's good. What are the ratings and what do the Nielsen say? And so you're striving for that rather than ultimately delivering the news or the real story. And again, from both sides. I have certain sources I've used, and boy, have they been wrong. But in the first week of December, I sat down and had an interview with an attorney who's really plugged in, and he was telling me in 2 weeks, Kushner's going to be indicted. Well, you know,
okay.
I mean, most of the things
Hang on here, Rob. I got to jump in here.
Wrong.
Guys, we've run out of time. I certainly miss Walter Cronkite. Many thanks to my guests in New York and in Los Angeles. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.